Welcome to part 9 of module 1 of this course on risk management fundamentals for farming enterprises. And in this part 9, we're looking at defining what is called the risk meta language. In the previous parts, we did define what risk is and also looked at the two critical attributes of risk. But now we want to make sure that as we journey through this course, we begin to get a lot more sharper in the way we really identify risks that really matter to our farming enterprises. And that's where this concept on the risk meta language comes in. And I remember I actually came into contact with the risk meta language way back when I worked for the Swedish embassy as financial controller. I remember we were in Stockholm, Sweden, at Swedish SIDA headquarters, and one of our resource persons was a gentleman called the risk doctor, and that's the first time I actually got to really understand what the risk meta language really is. It basically is a concept that seeks to ensure that any risk statement has 3 ingredients. You can actually identify what the cause of the risk is, and what the risk really is, and how that then impacts on your project objectives. In this case, you're looking at that risk that you have identified. How does that impact on the objectives of your farming enterprise? And remember, we just looked at the different objectives of a farming enterprise, and I'm hoping by now you probably have a pen and paper where you've actually already started putting together some of the different objectives for your farming enterprise. So whether you're doing dairy farming, you're doing cattle, ranching, you're doing pigs, horticulture farming, you can actually draw different farming objectives based on the guidance that I just outlined in the preceding module, which was 1.8. So why is it important to actually look at the risk statement from the perspective of the risk meta language, where you identify what the cause is, the risk, and the impact? Basically, what it means is that once you've got that risk statement well articulated to actually have these 3 ingredients, when you are developing risk mitigation measures, you basically focus on what the cause is. So I know it's taking time for that risk meta language kind of sink in. Let's look at an example from obviously our sector, again, from a farming perspective. Guess that will enable us to appreciate this concept a lot better. So I do get hired sometimes to actually get on farms to do farm diagnosis. And most often you find here's a farm owner, takes you to the farm and tells you, look, Bruno, one of the things that I'm actually suffering from on this farm, one is frequent thefts. That's issue number 1. Issue number 2 is that this farming enterprise has actually become like a charitable entity. I don't get any money. I actually have to finance this farming enterprise from my other money, from either other enterprises or from my salary, for those that have a full-time job and then having a farm as a side hustle. So they basically think this farming enterprise is just milking me, other than the thefts, but then there's all these financial losses. It's basically a charitable entity. It's not a profitable enterprise, but I actually intend to run a farm that will reward me as the farm owner, as a shareholder. And sometimes you actually get on the farm. Say you're doing crop farming and you find there's weeds in all the fields. If you've got greenhouses, you get into this greenhouse, shed net, there's weeds everywhere. And then the other issues that I find in most of the farms when I actually do farm diagnosis is just neglected maintenance. You find there's this tractor, you can actually see, I don't know when it was last serviced, different pieces and parts of different farming equipment, really very poor, neglected maintenance of farm equipment. And then sometimes also it's just this element of disorderliness on the farm. You get on the farm, I've had colleagues that are in the diaspora and they tell you, oh, I've got a farm, go and visit my farm and just check for me if things are in order. You arrive on the farm like, hey guys, who's in charge? Sometimes magically, two people, each one is raising their arm. I'm in charge. And they're like, hey, who's really in charge here? Now that is disorderliness because you really need obviously to know who's in charge here. Now, if you are faced with these issues and you are the consultant that has actually gone on this farm, what do you think is the cause of all these issues that I have just outlined? Of course, there could be quite a lot of issues, but one of the major ones is just the absentia of leadership, the absentia of the farm owner. And that obviously precipitates itself into what we classically call telephone farming. So now let us look at how the risk meta language would actually apply, from the perspective of the telephone farmer in relation to those issues on the farm that I actually did talk about. So, like I said, the causes could actually be many, but one is the fact that there's just no leadership. You, the farm owner, who needs to actually be the entrepreneur to galvanize all the other factors of production, you are never there. So there's no leadership. But what is the risk there? One, there's a risk of delayed decision making. That's one. Inadequate supervision, reduced oversight of the farm operations. So you hear what I've articulated as a risk. And what does that then impact on in terms of your farm objectives? This might actually lead to resource allocation inefficiencies, increased vulnerability to other forms of risk such as theft and unauthorized activities, and generally there's this potential underperformance of the farming enterprise. Remember what they say is that it's what you inspect that gets done and not what you expect. I hope you got that right. It's what you inspect that gets done and not what you expect. So you actually begin to see that absentia of the farm owner where you farm on the phone, it's a huge risk that can actually precipitate itself to those issues that I did identify. So now, if we're actually looking at a complete risk statement guided by the risk meta language, how would this risk statement read? One of the examples of how this complete risk statement, which has all these ingredients of the risk meta language, would actually go like this. Due to the absence of the farm owner, the telephone farmer in this case, there's a risk of delayed decision-making, inadequate supervision, and reduced oversight of farm operations, potentially resulting in inefficiencies in resource allocation, increased vulnerability to risks such as theft or unauthorized activities, and potential underperformance of the farming enterprise. Now, obviously, this sounds like a very complete risk because in this risk statement, we can actually pick what the cause is, where the risk is, and what might actually be impacted in terms of your farming objectives. So when you look at this complete risk statement, you can actually see that if you're trying to fix this risk, one of the biggest issues is basically sorting out the presence of the leadership of that farm. And you actually find that a number of these issues that we actually did identify will be resolved. So this is the benefit of the risk meta language in risk identification. It avoids this issue where you get into a risk identification workshop and then people are raising their arms. What are the risks? They just tell you theft, inflation. Like you can't connect the dots. What does this impact in relation to our farm? So there must be some element of intelligence that is actually coming out of your risk identification and also risk statements.